He seeks to explain the role of mutual instruction and deliberative rhetoric in democratic decision-making. Pericles' Athenians recognize that at a given public discussion, only some people will actually serve as public speakers, but all citizens can and are expected to participate in making decisions as participating members and of the judging audience of voters. This means that the voters are not passive recipients of the rhetorical performances of public speakers. Rather, they are expected to be active judges, fully capable of dismissing the incompetent. Pericles acknowledges the possibility that some individuals may seek to free ride on the public goods produced by the political activity of others. Those who do not engage in the give and take of mutual instruction, those who would selfishly restrict their acquisition or employment of knowledge to their private ends, are not just apolitical, but useless. By implication, at least, these free riders deserve to be exposed as contemptible and sanctioned as such. According to Pericles, it's a conjunction of a unique form of government and a unique public culture that fosters the fusion of public and private interests. This is what facilitates the unique Athenian capacity to conjoin bold and decisive action with thoughtful public deliberations. Deliberation over public policy becomes a public process of teaching and learning when citizens have access to openly available information and when they judge reasoned arguments. Thucydides' Pericles describes the democratic collectivity as a set of choice-making individuals, each freely striving to improve his personal circumstances. Pericles overtly contrasts this Athenian collective action-based understanding of the cooperative group as emerging from an equilibrium among the rational individual choices made by free agents with the Spartan approach to community. Sparta's approach is based on compulsory conformity, education as indoctrination, conditioned behavior, hostility to any expression of individual difference, and rejection of new or foreign ideas. Pericles' speech culminates in his vision of Athens not only as an education to its own citizens, but as a model that others might fruitfully seek to emulate. Although, notably, exactly how this emulation will manage to coexist with sustained Athenian uniqueness, he does not say. Thucydides' method as a historian and as a social theorist is to intersperse speeches with historical narrative. Accordingly, having considered a couple of speeches, we turn from Thucydides' account of the Corinthian assessment and Pericles' funeral oration to his narrative of the revolt of Mytilene in 428-27 and the campaign at Pylos in 425. One could, of course, choose other passages from early in the Peloponnesian War and thereby show how things go wrong in Athenian military operations. But if we're to explain the remarkable Athenian rise to wealth and power, which led to the huge resource base with which Athens began the war, we need to grasp why and how things so often went right in Athenian military operations. In the summer of 428, the oligarchic polis of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos revolted from Athens. After news of the revolt was brought to Athens from several quarters, the Athenians dispatched 40 warships to Lesbos. The Mytilenean oligarchs proved ill-prepared to defend themselves. After the Athenians arrived on Lesbos and established a naval blockade, the oligarchs' hopes were pinned on receiving support from Sparta. Mytilenean envoys ran the blockade. Arriving in Olympia, they emphasized to the Peloponnesians that the Athenians were stretched thin as a result of plague and multi-theater operations. They claimed that a renewed Spartan land-sea operation against Athenian territory would be sure of success. The Spartans were persuaded, but in the event their allies were slow to muster, quote, being those engaged in harvesting their grain crop and tired of making military expeditions. Meanwhile, the Athenians responded to the renewed Peloponnesian threat with a devastating show of force, manning 100 more warships by embarking most of the available manpower of the city. Thucydides notes that in this summer, in 428, saw a record number of Athenian warships in service, some 250 in all, and that the expense was immense. In order to pay for the necessary operations, the Athenians taxed themselves. They levied a 200-talent property tax and sent commanders to collect more imperial funds. With their 100 extra warships, the Athenians descended upon the Peloponnesian coast, ravaging at will. The discouraged Spartans disbanded their half-assembled invasion force. They did, however, prepare to send a fleet to Mytilene under the Spartan general Alcidas. With the invasion threat from the Peloponnese stymied, the Athenians dispatched the general, Paches, to Mytilene along with additional forces. The Athenian hoplites, heavy-armed infantrymen sent out with Paches, rowed themselves in the triremes, the oared warships, to Lesbos, and then built a siege wall to complement the naval blockade. The Spartan fleet under Alcidas failed to show up in Lesbos. Hard pressed by the siege, the Mytilenean oligarchs armed their lower classes, who then demanded distributions of grain. If we're going to fight, it would be nice to eat. The oligarchs immediately surrendered unconditionally to Paches. There's a lesson here. The revolt suppressed, Paches chased Alcidas and his fleet out of the Aegean. The Spartan admiral had botched what Thucydides regarded as real opportunities, accomplishing little beyond slaughtering some prisoners of war taken from Athens' subject allies. Paches, meanwhile, crushed the remaining pockets of lesbian resistance. He was able to demobilize most of his Athenian forces before summer's end. He now awaited orders from Athens regarding the disposition of his Mytilenean prisoners. In the aftermath of the famous Mytilenean debate, one of the most famous passages in Thucydides, the Athenians spared the bulk of the population, but executed over 1,000 Mytileneans, whom they regarded as especially culpable, and confiscated the agricultural land of Mytilene. The operations of 428 to 27 seem to confirm the Corinthian contrast between agile, ambitious, and common good-seeking Athenians and inept Spartans, and indeed to highlight a distinction between Athenian capacities and those of the Peloponnesian coalition. Each side attempts to launch a complex land-sea operation on short notice, an operation which presents difficult problems of coordination and very considerable expenditure of resources. The Peloponnesians fail to pull it off because they put the continuity of their own agricultural enterprises first and had become sick of service in foreign expeditionary forces. The Spartans eventually do launch a fleet, but its commander moves too slowly to aid the Mytileneans and thinks too narrowly to accomplish any other strategic end. The Mytilenean oligarchs themselves seem incapable of reasoning through their planned revolt. When the distant hope of effective Spartan intervention falls through, the only card they have to play, arming the Mytilenean demos, proves fatal to their enterprising. The yawning gap between the interests of rulers and ruled and oligarchic Mytilene dooms the capacity of Mytilene as a community to resist Athens' attack. By contrast, the Athenians act according to the spirit of the Corinthian assessment, despite the devastation of plague and their multiple commitments elsewhere. Their informal intelligence network brings advance warnings of Mytilenean intentions, which allows them to intervene before the enemy's preparations have been completed. Athenian military pressure can thus achieve more with less force. The Athenian military response to the revolt is masterful and multifaceted. The closely coordinated naval blockade of Mytilene, siege works, land operations against other lesbian cities, and naval patrols in the Aegean accomplish the desired end and with dispatch. The threat of a Peloponnesian land-sea invasion in late summer 428 fails to panic the Athenians. By digging deep into their reserves of human and material resources, they launch a stunningly large naval force with which they ravage the Peloponnesian coast. This force, like the reinforcements that accompany Paches to Mytilene, is manned by Athenian heavy infantry. Athenian hoplites, it turns out, are capable oarsmen, and they take up oars without the foot dragging that stymied plans for a Peloponnesian land-sea expedition. The operations of 428 and 427 reveal that all-important technical expertise of rowing Athenian warships to an Athenian standard. It's actually a very technical matter, rowing a warship. It's not a matter, you can't just get on these things and start pulling an oar and expect the boat to go anyplace. So it reveals that this expertise was widely dispersed within the Athenian citizen population. When the occasion demanded it, demanded it. There was no resistance on the part of the middle-class hoplites to take on the oarsman's role, a role usually filled by lower-class citizens. Athenian infantrymen willingly risked their bodies, not only by standing tall on the battlefield, but also by bending over an oar. Athenian military proficiency would not suffer because the hoplites refused to assume the position of oarsmen. Neither technical incapacity nor social distaste stood in the way of generating the required level of projectable power and at the right moment. Once again, there seems a clear connection between democratic culture, with its emphasis on basic equality among a socially diverse citizenry, the wide distribution of certain kinds of technical expertise, and Athenian military proficiency. Just as the hoplite accepted a lower-class fellow citizen as an equal when sitting in assembly or on a jury, so too he accepted the lower-class role of rower when the common good demanded it. And upon arrival at his destination, he proved to be a willing and skilled wall builder in the bargain. So you have to imagine these hoplites, in a sense, putting down their spear, picking up their oar, putting up down their oar, picking up their spear, putting down their spear, picking up their shovel, and just doing all of this pretty seamlessly. The capacity of the individual Athenian to acquire a wide range of technical skills and to recombine various of his diverse abilities into new skill sets as the situation demanded meant that the Athenians could be flexible in deploying their manpower reserves. The military narrative gives substance to what might otherwise seem an empty boast in Pericles' funeral oration. Quote, "I doubt if the world can produce a man who, where he has only himself to depend upon, is equal to so many emergencies and graced by so happy a versatility as the Athenian, and that this is no mere boast thrown out for the occasion, but a plain matter of fact, the power of the state acquired by these habits proves." End quote. For Thucydides' Pericles, then, it is the power produced by individual Athenian technical versatility that is the proof of Athenian exceptionalism, an exceptionalism that is, earlier in the funeral oration, explicitly associated with the democratic constitution and with the special education and unlimited opportunity to excel that it offers to each Athenian citizen. What is particularly striking about the Mytilene narrative is that Thucydides' readers now realize that the ability to excel is not limited to upward social mobility, but implies mobility to any point on the social status or labor map that the state demanded. We can treat the Pylos operation of 425 more succinctly. In the summer of 425, the Athenians dispatched 40 ships to Sicily. Demosthenes, a sporadically successful general, currently out of office, sailed along. He had received special permission from the assembly to borrow this fleet for side operations against the Peloponnese en route to Sicily if the situation seemed to warrant it. Badgered by Demosthenes and then forced by the weather, the fleet commanders ordered a stopover at Pylos, a headland on the southwestern Peloponnesian coast in the territory of Messenia. Demosthenes urged that this strategic site be fortified and employed as a base for supporting local anti-Spartan Messenian resistance fighters. Soon the Athenian rowers, quote, "wanting occupation," began to fortify the place. They had no masonry tools to cut stone blocks, but they made do fitting field stones together to form walls and carrying mortar on their backs. The Spartans at first failed to respond to the Athenian landing, and within 6 days the fortification at Pylos was defensible. Demosthenes was left at Pylos with a small garrison as the rest of the fleet continued on to Sicily. The Spartans now awakened to the danger. They dispatched 60 ships and a land force to Pylos, hoping to retake the headland before Athenian naval reinforcements could arrive. In preparation for this, the Spartans landed some 420 soldiers on the little island of Sphacteria, which lay before Pylos. Faced with a formidable Athenian assault force, Demosthenes armed the oarsmen of his garrison with whatever weapons and shields he could assemble. 2 days of Spartan assaults failed to budge the Athenian defenders. Now an Athenian relief force arrived, disabled the Spartan naval force, and immediately began circling Sphacteria, thereby preventing the safe withdrawal of those 420 Spartan soldiers who are now stranded on the island. Meanwhile, the Spartan land force maintained a land siege of the fort at Pylos, so we have a double siege going on. While diplomatic negotiations attempted to resolve this double blockade and double siege operation, the Spartans resupplied their men trapped on Sphacteria. Helot, that is, Spartan serf blockade runners, were paid by their Spartan masters to smuggle provisions over to the island in small boats, and by divers who swam under the water, dragging behind them skins packed with prepared food. The siege ended when the Athenian politician Cleon arrived with a large force of light-armed men, landed on the island of Sphacteria, killed half of the Spartan soldiers, and brought the rest of them back to Athens as prisoners of war, all within 20 days of setting out from Athens, as he had promised he would do. The Pylos campaign reprises key Athenian characteristics. Athenian commanders at Pylos are innovative and effective. Lacking formal authority, Demosthenes employs persuasion to accomplish his strategic ends. As soon as Cleon assumes command, he recruits exactly the right force needed to reduce the Spartans on Sphacteria. At Pylos, Cleon and Demosthenes work smoothly together. These two unofficial generals launch the assault with neither delay nor undue haste, and Cleon meets his self-imposed deadline without apparent difficulty. The Athenian oarsmen go their fellow citizen hoplites, who had rowed themselves to Mytilene a few years before and had built that siege wall a few years before. The Athenian oarsmen go those hoplites one better. Unwilling to remain inactive, they take up Demosthenes' suggestion that they build a fortification capable of holding off the Spartan army, and they then fight successfully as infantrymen with improvised weaponry against overwhelming odds. We may compare the self-confident, proactive behavior of the Athenian oarsmen at Pylos with the passivity of the Spartan hoplites on Sphacteria. The Spartans prove incapable of formulating a plan to save themselves. It's not surprising, in retrospect, that they failed to defeat the huge force of light-armed men brought against them, but why need they have been stranded on Sphacteria in the first place? Thucydides tells us that Helots, motivated by promise of material gain, successfully transported supplies to the island by boat and by swimming, running the Athenian blockade. Why then could the Spartans on the island not risk using the boats or swimming back from the island to the safety of their comrades on the shore? I mean, what, one-way boats? Did it never occur to the Spartan soldiers on Sphacteria to take any action for which they had not been trained and for which had not been mandated by their home government? Well, Thucydides does not tell us. But the contrast between the innovative, active Athenian oarsmen on Pylos and the passive Spartan infantrymen on Sphacteria underlines the contrast between Athenian and Spartan behavior that had been set out in the Corinthian assessment and in Pericles' funeral oration. Well, the Mytilene and Pylos campaigns illustrate Athenian naval and land-sea operations at their most effective, and they're clearly meant by Thucydides to make a point. They stand as practical manifestations of the Corinthian assessment, and therefore of the potential organizational proficiency that enabled democratic Athens to build an Aegean empire, to confront Sparta head-on during the Periclean era, and then to fight the Peloponnesians successfully in the years following Pericles' death. Thucydides saw that Athenian military success was substantially based on the deployment of social and technical knowledge, just as he regarded Athenian military failures, most spectacularly in Sicily in 415 to 413, as examples of what happens when democratic management of knowledge goes awry. Taken together, the Corinthian assessment and the funeral oration suggest that Athenian military proficiency arose and was sustained quite directly by a distinctive approach to the organization of knowledge. The Athenian knowledge regime drew on the talents of leaders like Pericles, Paches, Demosthenes, and Cleon, but it also rested upon a broad and deep foundation. shared social knowledge that transcended class lines, widely distributed expertise in regard to key skills, especially rowing, and key experience in the exercise of deliberative capacity by a sociologically diverse population. The distinctive Athenian approach to the distribution and employment of useful knowledge is linked to the political practices and ideological commitments that Pericles had argued were characteristic of Athens' participatory democracy. It is because they were well schooled in the civic culture of democracy that the Athenians were willing to share what they knew, to aggregate their knowledge through deliberative processes, and to act decisively in consequence of collective decisions. While Thucydides is certainly attentive to the issue of institutionalized leadership, he also points to the essential role played by the versatility of the individual Athenian trooper. The Mytilenean and Pylos operations demonstrate the essential asymmetry between the potential of the individual Athenian combatant and his Spartan counterpart. In 428, the Spartans proved utterly ineffectual at naval operations, and at Sphacteria, the Spartan hoplites are rendered passive victims by their incapacity to think outside their accustomed role as hoplites. By contrast, the Athenian warrior, whether hoplite or oarsman, possessed a broad-based skill set. He had both the capacity and the willingness to adapt his skills to unfamiliar conditions, improvising tools as necessary to accomplish the goals that he had set for himself in conjunction with his fellows. Well, it's all too easy to essentialize that difference as a matter of inherent national character rather than learned and therefore potentially imitable behavior. The Corinthians, of course, do essentialize Athenian character in their assessment of the two sides before the war. But so, catastrophically, did the Athenians. In the run-up to the attack on Sicilian Syracuse in 415, the Athenian citizenry willingly bought into the leader Alcibiades' jingoistic claim that Athenians would betray their own nature if they deferred ambitious imperialistic projects. Athenian abilities were gained through the process of being educated in an open-access democratic culture. Imitation was not a simple matter, but it was quite possible. In coming to believe falsely that their capacities were both unique and innate, the Athenians failed to see that they faced in the Syracusan opponent individuals who mirrored their own core attributes. In retrospect, it was predictable that Syracuse would prove a much tougher nut to crack than Mytilene. Like Athens, Syracuse was a very large polis with a democratic constitution and the associated habits of innovation, tenacity, and capacity to organize useful knowledge that I've argued was Athens' own core capacity. Urged on by Alcibiades' rhetoric to become their own true selves by attacking Syracuse, the Athenians began to drink their own Kool-Aid, which is current American business slang for what happens when a company's insiders begin to believe an over-optimistic public relations image originally meant for external consumption. It's actually used all the time. Drinking the Kool-Aid considered a big danger. As the Athenians came to imagine that Athens was not only exceptional, but unique and inimitable, they formed the dangerously foolish idea that a big enough invasion force would also be an invincible force. It was not, as the surviving Athenians learned to their horror 2 years later. In seeking to understand the sources of democratic success at war, we can learn a lot from the Athenian approach to collective action, but we should also learn not to repeat the Athenian errors. And this means we must not begin to drink the Kool-Aid of pundits who offer us simplistic, essentialist, even racist versions of Western exceptionalism. Athens has a good deal to teach us about the potential of democracy as a form of social learning and knowledge organization. But Athens also teaches us that the power and prosperity that can be promoted by democratic culture and institutional design can lead to fantasies about innate character and delusions of omnipotence. When those fantasies and delusions lead to the use of democratic power and prosperity for grandiose and chaotic military projects, we should not be surprised when it results in a great deal of unnecessary suffering and by a great many people. Obviously and sadly, there is no need to look back as far as ancient Athens for examples of grandiose and misconstrued military projects launched by democratic states. Thinking hard about Athens can help us to see that modern military adventurism is not just an aberration produced by a few deluded leaders who came to power at a particular historical moment. The story of democracy and war is not all dark. If you think, as I do, that fighting wars is sometimes necessary, and if you believe, as I do, that democracy is better than tyranny, then you may be glad, as I sometimes am, that democracies can be unexpectedly good at warfare. If we accept that there are such things as just wars, then democratic excellence at warfare should be acknowledged as a potential good thing, and perhaps even occasionally as something worth celebrating. This does not entitle us to forget how often the military proficiency that enables a well-organized democracy to win wars has led to jingoistic adventurism. 2,500 years after democracy was invented, modern democracies remain better at social choice than they are at moral choice. And nothing brings out that asymmetry more clearly than the history of unnecessary and unjust wars begun by democratic states. Thank you very much.